Hello, Acts parents. I wanted to share with you just a snapshot of what we've been doing in the class about the book of Acts with your students. And I wanted to just kind of run through one of my absolute favorite chapters in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 12 is a chapter that during your first read, you might not even think of it as that important. In fact, Acts 11 ends with Paul and Barnabas in Antioch ready to go out on their missionary journey. And then Acts 13 begins with Paul and Barnabas in Antioch, ready to go out on their missionary journey. In fact, if you ripped Acts 12 out of the book of Acts, you probably wouldn't even know it was missing. And yet Acts 12 has such a powerful message for the rest of the book of Acts, and I think for all of our students and parents, that I wanted to camp on it with you for a little bit. When I was at Liberty University, I actually studied Acts 12 with great intensity. I wrote my honors thesis on it, and I just have fallen in love with this chapter. And I love how it's so easy to miss, and yet I think it is so profound when we camp there. So let's talk about Acts 12 for a second. In Acts chapter 12, we have three main events that occur. First, we're going to see James, one of the core apostles, right? So remember, Jesus had 12 disciples, and inside that group of 12, he had three that were kind of his inner circle: Peter, James, and John. Well, we've seen Peter and John a ton in the book of Acts. They've been sharing the gospel, speaking the truth, and having thousands come to accept Christ, and we didn't really hear anything about James. And we think that's because we're going to find out in Acts 12 that early on in the church's spread, James is going to be killed by Herod, the king of the Jews, this Jewish ruler who was kind of a puppet ruler for the Roman Empire, but he was a Jew himself. King Herod, the king of the Jews. He's going to have James killed. And so, as far as we can tell, Luke, the author of the book of Acts, never got to meet James. And so that's why we don't get to know a lot about James or his stories, because he never got that interview where Luke is then going to compile these things into his book. But surely James was doing things just like Peter and John, because why would Herod have wanted to kill him if he was silent about his faith? Surely he may have been the most vocal witness, and that's why he's the first person targeted by King Herod. So James, one of the inner three apostles, is killed. And it gets it in one verse. It just says, and Herod had James put to death. And if your eyes skip a line, you don't even see that it happened. And there's no fanfare. There's no summary of how everyone mourned for him. It's just he died. And then Herod sees that it pleases the Jews. And so he decides, well, let's keep rolling with this. And so he arrests Peter as well. And so you have this moment in church history where if I'm a church member at that time, so far in the book of Acts, the apostles have been persecuted, but none of them have died. And in their mind, they're thinking maybe God's going to preserve these men until he comes back. They have this mindset that Christ is going to return any moment, and so God needs his 12 rulers ready to rule over the 12 tribes of Israel when surely Christ returns and set up his kingdom. And now James, one of the inner three apostles, one of the people that spent more time with Jesus than anyone else on earth, is killed in a sentence. And Peter, another one of those inner three, is now arrested. And surely in their mind they're thinking, well, he's going to die too. Why wouldn't he die when God let James die? And so it says the church was earnestly praying for Peter. And in the middle of the night, even though Peter was being guarded by 16 soldiers and chained to 2 soldiers, one on each arm, and he's asleep in the inner cell of the prison, it says an angel appears in the middle of the night and strikes him on the side and says, Peter, get up, wrap your cloak around you and get going. And it says literally the chains fell off his wrists and the doors open wide and he walks out the first door and walks out the second door, and then the iron gate to the gate of the prison swings open and Peter walks out. And Peter, it's so crazy for Peter that he assumes he must be having a vision. I mean, he can't imagine this is actually happening. And when they step out into the street, it says the angel leaves Peter and he goes, oh, this really happened. And so what I love about these stories is that it's so easy to focus on the long one. The story of Peter's escape takes up a good number of verses. And it's such a great story, right? The chains fall off his wrist, the doors swing open, an angel walks Peter out of prison while 16 guards don't even notice. I mean, what a miracle. That it's easy to forget how the chapter started. James, someone who was in the same position of Peter and surely was just as loved by the church, and I have to imagine people were praying for James just like they were praying for Peter. And as far as we can tell, Peter wasn't better than James or more equipped than James, and yet James is arrested by Herod and killed. And so it begs the question, why does James die and Peter get to escape? And throughout the book of Acts, one of these themes, if you remember from the first video we posted, the 10 themes of Acts, one of the dominant themes is the sovereignty of God. And Luke wants us to see that God is in control. And so the beauty of putting these two stories together is Luke is going to show us that God is in control. Whether your outcome is like James, and you are faithful unto death, or your outcome is like Peter, where God miraculously intervenes and frees you from the clutches and gives you an extended life, God is in control. And I've seen this happen so often, and it's one of those things where we as humans love to ask that question, well, why did this happen for James and not Peter? Well, that's one of those things where we are the clay and God is the potter, and who are we to look up at him and say, what are you doing? And we're going to find in the book of Acts that it seems as though God called James home because he had completed his tasks. We see throughout the book of Acts that God gives different people the Holy Spirit filling to do different tasks. And so for James, it seems as though his tasks were accomplished. Peter has more tasks to do. And so we know that Peter was able to do more things and share the gospel in Rome and write the books of 1st and 2nd Peter. But for James, he had his task complete, and it was time for him to go home. Not that one task was more important or better, or that one person was more holy, or someone prayed more, but God had different plans, different tasks for different people, and we trust that God is in control. And I shared examples of this with our students, and I tried to demonstrate all these times in my life where I saw God having two different scenarios and two different outcomes, and how we've been able to see that God's in control. I told them the story of Mr. Baumgartner. Many of your students might have Mr. Baumgartner currently. Mr. Baumgartner was my high school history teacher, and he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in his abdomen, and there were multiple times he believed he was going to be called home. And we circled around his house out in Portsmouth, and we prayed over him, and we sent him cards and spent time with him in the hospital. And praise the Lord, Mr. Baumgartner was healed in a way that the doctors did not expect, and he is still teaching Norfolk Christian history now, today. And then we tell the story of Dr. Sandwell, someone who taught at Norfolk Christian for more than a decade and was a leader of the Bible department, and he was diagnosed with cancer in his abdomen, stage 4, and we prayed over him and prayed at his house, and we even thought we were going to see a healing, and yet God called Dr. Sandwell home. And so I asked the students this question: in which of those two stories was God in control? And the answer, as hard as it is for us to imagine this, is both. God had more tasks for Mr. Baumgartner to complete, and he did not have more tasks for Dr. Sandwell. And now Dr. Sandwell is rejoicing in perfect unity with the Spirit, with the Holy Father, and we mourn his loss. That doesn't make the loss easier, but we know that God was in control. God could have spared his life, but he chose not to because he had different tasks. And so I tell students stories like this all the time, where I see both scenarios laid out, and yet God uses one to bring about his glory through miraculous means, and the other one, God doesn't answer the prayer we may have been lifting, but we can trust that God is in control. So what is Luke doing in Acts 12? He is showing the church for the rest of the book of Acts, if you're going to be a faithful witness, which has been another one of his themes, you need to understand that you will face persecution. And God might spare you, and God might not. But don't think for a minute that God not sparing you is because God has somehow been overcome by the world, or God has fallen asleep on your guard. No, God has plans, and at some point God will call all of us home. Peter later died by persecution, by execution, and we wouldn't say that God stopped being sovereign later in Peter's life. It was just the end of all the tasks God had called Peter to accomplish. And so, when we see different outcomes in our lives, some that we prayed for and some that we prayed against, we can trust from Acts 12 that God is in control of both. And it just depends on what tasks God has given each of us, and who are we to question who gets what task, right? Different parts of the body, how can we complain about which part we get to have? It's an honor that we get to be any part of it at all, and we need to trust that God is in control, both in stories like James, where he calls us home, and in stories like Peter, where we had this awesome miracle to point people to. So I hope Acts 12 encourages you. I encourage you to have a conversation with your students about times in your family, in your background, where you've seen God come through the way you hoped, and maybe God didn't come through the way you had hoped, but God came through nonetheless in a way that maybe you didn't expect. All right, thank you so much for watching this clip about Acts 12, and I hope that you're able to share this with your students as you have conversations. Bye.